out for this. My name is Anthony Pawlicki, although I do like Pawlicki a lot. As Craig alluded to, I'll be talking about the reproductive ecology of the flat-tailed horned lizard. And Craig pretty much went over the overview for the species, so I'll kind of skip over this, but I will point out one thing that comes to my study is we did our study in Yuma, and most reproductive studies have been done in California, or if they're from museum specimens, the vast majority of those museum specimens were from California populations. Yeah, flat-tailed horned lizards are honestly probably my favorite horned lizard, although Ditmarsii are a very, very close second. Being able to go out and find those was super awesome a couple of years ago. But as we know, flat-tailed horned lizards love to eat ants, and I'm not an entomologist, so I kind of describe them as the big black ants, the big red and black ants, and then you have these really little tiny ants that almost seems like I always find hatchling horned lizards at all the time. And there's just a little baby right there going around eating some ants and then doing push-ups afterwards. I was processing another hatchling that I found within 2 meters of that individual, and I looked up and I just saw him eating ants, and so I don't know if he was doing the push-ups because I was still there and he was aware of me or what was going on, but just a cool little sighting. So for my study, I was looking at reproduction of flat-tailed horned lizards in Yuma, Arizona, and so we were assessing reproductive condition. We were using radiotelemetry to monitor their movements and be able to look at behavior. We also were monitoring nests after the females laid their eggs, and I won't get to this last thing because we have not done the analysis on it yet, but we also took a ton of genetic samples to look at dispersal and also look at parentage. So we're up here in Phoenix, and that's probably the second hottest city in Arizona after Yuma. I came down to do the study after my undergraduate degree up at the University of Maine, so it was a big shock for me going from Maine all the way down to Yuma, where easily 120 during the summer. Alright, so you have Yuma up here in the city and all the agriculture. We did most of our work out on the Barium Goldwater Range, which is managed by the Marine Corps Air Station in Yuma, and we also did some work over here on some Bureau of Reclamation land that was also located right next to a prison, so that was pretty fun. Out there, it's a pretty idyllic landscape for looking for horned lizards. Craig had a very good photo in the research showing me tracking a horned lizard, where there's very little vegetation out there, especially after years where there is very little to no winter rain. This was after a year with a pretty good amount of winter rain, and it's still pretty sparse, but it was a little bit tougher to find horned lizards. There'd be some days in the year after we had no winter rains that you could go out and find like 15 horned lizards in a day with processing in about 3 hours. It was kind of crazy. So in this landscape, there's really nice sand out there, and so it's really easy for us. We just go out and we look for tracks, and you follow the tracks, and sometimes there's a horned lizard just sitting out on the surface, so it makes it super easy. Although, because of the sand, they also like to bury themselves in the sand and hide themselves. And they also have this dark vertebral stripe that almost kind of mimics a plant stem shadow. And there's actually a horned lizard in here. This picture, you can see some tracks right here, you can see some tracks right here. It goes around and ends up being right there. It's really hard to see. It's a lot easier when you're like 2 feet away from them. So we did most of our work from 2017 to 2019, and then in 2020 we caught an additional 50 lizards, and that was more for the genetic analyses looking at the impact of this area service highway going through here in Avenue B. We had some focal areas out on the Barium Goldwater Range. As you can see, there's tons of individuals out there, and then really kind of 2 focal areas out on the Bureau of Reclamation land. We were able to capture almost 1,400 unique individuals, and we marked adults with pit tags, and we marked hatchlings by using a toe clipping scheme. It was about 50-50 males and females, and almost about the same for the number of adults, subadults, and hatchlings. and we used about a 60 millimeter cutoff, which is the minimum SVL currently for flat-tailed horned lizards. Although in 2018 we did see a little bit smaller male doing what we thought was some courting behaviors with a much larger female that was carrying a radio transmitter. This female did not end up becoming gravid, but to look for females that were gravid, it was super easy. They were really fat. You also could palpate the eggs, and if they were far enough along, you can actually just see the ova just by simply flipping them over. So once we found a gravid female flat-tailed horned lizard, we put a 1.4 gram transmitter on them, and we attached this with a adhesive, and then we also put some sand on there on the sides and on the top to try and help it blend in with the environment. So in 2017, we tracked 29 actual females. We tracked 3 of them twice because it appeared that they were going to be double clutching. We ended up getting 20 of those animals to lay nests. 2018 was a bit of a down year. I'll go into that a little more later. And then 2019, we tracked 29 individuals again, and we only had 16 nests out of that. Luckily, most of our animals survived. We did have one predation by a loggerhead shrike. As Craig noted, they do love flat-tailed horned lizards. And this was a gravid female, and she had 4 pretty large ova inside of her when the shrike ended up killing her. My boss, Matt Good, actually, they went out in 2016 and went along this fence that's about 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet by 10 feet and found, I think it was around 70 horned lizard skulls on that fence. So kind of sad, but kind of a cool way to go out because then you just get pinned up through your mouth. So I don't think it's the worst thing. Although when we do actually have females that survive and are able to go lay their nests, we saw something that was actually pretty cool. We saw them actually moving fairly large distances. This is an individual called G055, and she was very interesting. She actually only had 4 burrows in the 3 weeks or so that we tracked her, and she spends most of this time in this one burrow, and then you'll see her shoot up, and she goes about 250 meters to the north, right there, and she'll spend about 2 days in her nest burrow, and then she shoots right back down to her normal burrow. And then we also saw this large movement to lay their nest a couple times, and it seems like maybe they're doing exploratory searches to be able to find maybe good microhabitats for this nest. You'll see this individual here is going to zoom out over here a couple times, checking nest, and she ends up going to lay a nest over here. You can see there's one search, and then she laid her nest there, and then she was just kind of moving around in her normal activity area. So when we analyze these movements, this is the distance moved from the center of their activity area when we were tracking them. We did see that the movements to nest burrows were pretty large, almost double the size of normal movements, and some of these normal movements are also those going out to test for burrows and everything. We saw up to a 426 meter movement to their nest, and they're small lizards and they usually don't go very far, so it was pretty dramatic. You'd be like, this lizard is not anywhere close to where I think it should be. Also, with the large movement, something that we keyed in on was burrow backfilling. And once we realized that the flat-tailed horned lizards were doing this, super easy to be able to find out in landscape if they were there. We're also lucky enough to be able to see an individual actually do it. This is on a time-lapse trail camera. And this is actually Go55, who's that individual that had that one burrow, and then she went right back. So this is her backfilling her nest. I'm not totally sure if she's gonna backfill all the way down to the egg chamber, if she just does it up top. But this is presumed to be an anti-predatory thing. You also saw right there, she stopped thermoregulate for a little bit. And then she's gonna keep on just doing those scratch marks, and then she zoomed right back to her normal burrow. And so once we saw this behavior while we were out looking for lizards, if we found a nest, we were like, okay, let's just be able to look at this. And we actually were able, in 2018, I found this, which looked pretty much like a nest bearing situation. I followed the tracks, and there was a fringe-toed lizard that was at the end of those tracks, not a flat tail. And then in 2019, I'll show you in just a second how many of these random nests that we found. But we had one of these marked, and I'll go more into how we kind of put the enclosures on. And when we came back in a couple weeks, there are baby zebra-tailed lizards in there. So they seem to do the same exact thing as the flat-tailed horned lizards. So these were our nest enclosures. It was just aluminum flashing. The radius was about 1.5 meters out from the center of the burrow. And so in 2017, we had 19 nests. 14 of those were buried. So we did have occasions where we thought a female laid, even though she didn't necessarily do that bearing behavior, due to that long distance movement, plus also the large loss of mass that we would get by weighing them. In 2018, I'll get to this more later too, there was like no reproduction out there. It was kind of weird. And in 2019, we ended up getting a lot of random nests. And we did have 8 successful flat-tailed horned lizard nests, although I will say we had about 7 nests at the end of 2019 that would have hatched out in mid-November. And based on looking at the nest that had hatched out before, I was like, okay, at least 4 of these will hatch out and be good. And then in October, we had a cold snap. And a cold snap in Yuma means that it's like highs in the 80s, which is obviously just crazy. But I was wondering if that possibly could have killed the eggs in there, or like ceased incubation, and they just ended up dying and not hatching out, because we went an extra month past what we thought their incubation rate was at. But when you do get little babies to come out, they usually come out pretty close to where the entrance of the burrow is at. These ones actually came out right at the entrance, and they are the most adorable little things. So we ended up getting 64 hatchlings emerge from the 16 nests, so a perfect mean clutch size of 4. Although our range was from 1 to 6, it usually was around 3 or 4 individuals. And this is a little bit smaller than what has been found in museum specimens and individuals from California, although ours may be less because this is the amount of successful hatchlings that actually emerge from the nest, not necessarily how many eggs were in the nest. We tried for a couple of nests to dig back in there and see if we could get down and see how far the nest was at after they emerged and see if there are any eggs, but we didn't find any ever. So we're also the first to report hatchling size, and so they're super tiny. They'll just fit right on your thumb. Mass between the 2 years was actually interesting. It was significantly different. So I don't know why exactly the individuals in 2019 were a lot smaller. Most of the nests in 2017 were out on the BMGR, which is more open, a lot less shrubs and vegetation. And in 2019, the vast majority of the nests were out on the Bureau of Reclamation land, which did have a little bit more denser vegetation. But it's Yuma, so dense vegetation means like there's like 4 creosotes in this little circle versus like 1. So, but SVL in both cases was 30, although we did have one clutch of, I think it was 5 individual hatchlings that came out, and they were all 35 millimeter SVL, which was interesting to me. So maybe it's just something genetically with those parents, just producing super baby little flat tails. So by putting those enclosures on there and knowing exactly when the female laid, we were able to actually get incubation rate, and it seems similar to other horned lizards that lay their eggs. As noted in here as well, there is a difference between 2017 and 2019, with 2019 taking an extra couple days to incubate those eggs. Maybe that's just something with the microhabitat of the nest between the 2 sites, which also makes me intrigued about what is going on in El Centro areas and areas in California, because Yuma's like flat tail heaven. It is like so easy to find them. You got this nice sand, and then you go out to El Centro and you're in hard pan and mud hills and rocks, and it's like you can't even track anything out there. And so just the soil itself is just very different. So I'd imagine there's something probably different about the reproductive activities out there. We're also looking at the date of the first hatchlings that we found. These weren't necessarily the first hatchlings that we found out of nest burrows. These were just out on our surveys. The earliest was June, and based on our days to incubate, it seemed like they were probably breeding in April and laying in early May. In 2018, it was super late. It was almost in August. And in 2019, it was the beginning of July. And our latest emergence out of a nest enclosure was early November. And if those 7 nests that failed would have actually emerged, they would have been about another week to 10 days after that November 2nd date. But we kind of saw that flat-tail hatchlings kind of just emerge throughout the year. It's possible, so we were looking at different sites throughout the year and going to different areas. Although we did kind of see anecdotally the potential for females in some areas to kind of time up their breeding. I don't necessarily think this is predator swamping, even though there are tons of predators out there. I think it might just be something having to do with the habitat and available resources, and that just timing up for all the females and just being the same. So getting back to why was 2018 such a horrible year? So in the red and the green, that is going to be 2017 and 2019. You have percentage of lizards over here, and then you have SVL classes over here and 5mm classes. And if you see the green and the red, you have a lot of hatchlings here, and then you have adults. And in 2018, you got a couple hatchlings, you got lots that fit in this juvenile subadult category, and then some adults as well. So why was that? Potentially due to the rainfall in the previous winter. In 2018, it was the worst precipitation since 2002. So almost a historic low, versus 2017 and 2019, although they're below the 80-year average, still seemed like they were good enough to be able to have enough plants, to be able to have enough ants, to then be able to feed the lizards, to have enough energy to reproduce. So our conclusions for this study, so we did see that some females did lay multiple clutches. I know that there's a study currently going on with Arizona Game and Fish trying to understand what percentage of females are able to double clutch. So hopefully they'll have some information on that. We also saw that they do have these large distances prior to laying their eggs, and so that may be one way to disperse their genetics. We also then saw that the females will backfill their nest burrows, and this is probably just anti-predatory. But as seen with Go 55, she was very similar to every other flat-tailed horned lizard female, and not staying in nest guarding. And I did see patch nose snakes out there, so that was kind of interesting, and just laying her eggs and then just going and then just leaving them be and just seeing how everything goes. We saw that hatchlings emerge about 6 weeks, a little over 6 weeks post oviposition, and then it seems like winter precipitation, as with most reptiles, seems to be the driver for reproduction. So as Craig alluded to, we're doing more with genomics and genetic samples. We have genetic samples from all 1,380 individuals that we got. So if you want to do a genetic study, just reach out, because we still have hundreds of samples. So we want to look at dispersal, and so we haven't been able to analyze this yet, although I do have some evidence of just a second event of dispersal in Yuma, in that in 2018 and 2019, we were able to recapture 27 individuals that were hatched out in the previous year, and the mean distance moved from where they were captured that time, which for some of those individuals was at their actual nest site, for some was just where we found them at. The mean distance moved to the new spot that we found them at was 248.3 meters. And that range was anywhere from 3 meters, which didn't fits that sedentary lifestyle that people say horned lizards have. The largest was just over 3 kilometers, which is a massive distance. And that individual also was a definite hatchling the previous year. I think he was between that 30 to 35 millimeter mark. And the next year I was walking up and I looked and I saw a flat tail after seeing some tracks, and I'm like, that's definitely a male. So he is full-blown adult the next year. And as you can, I'll go back to the 2017 and 2019 right here, how there are very, very little, especially in 2019, there's even both years, there's very little juveniles in here, which makes me wonder how active young of the year flat tails are during the winter. Especially with that individual, is very shocking and alarming to see him grow over 30 millimeters, almost double in size over the winter essentially, because I caught him in the springtime the next year, and he was a full-blown adult, ready to go, ready to mate and everything. So I feel like they have to be active during the winter. And probably these winter rains help drive maybe ants coming out earlier, the vegetation coming out earlier, and maybe the individuals coming out earlier or staying out later in the year.
We have about 5 minutes for questions.
Okay. And then I'll just thank you to everyone that has helped on this project. There was a lot of work, a lot of really good funders, everyone at mcallii to make sure that we weren't hit by an errant airstrike out there. The jets got pretty low one time, so it got a little scary. And yeah, everyone just that helped out with the field work. We had some volunteers from the local community college, and I know Craig talked about getting the community involved and getting younger people involved. And this was also my first field job coming out of college, so it was super, super awesome, great animal to work with, great people to work with. And yeah, I'll take questions if there are any.